I never imagined marriage would turn me into a servant. On the night of my mother-in-law's grand party, she looked me straight in the eye and said, "You'll serve drinks tonight." Guests whispered as I carried trays like hired help, their laughter cutting deeper than any blade. I bit my tongue, letting their mockery echo through the chandelier-lit hall. They thought I was powerless, the outsider clinging to their family's wealth. What they didn't know was that every step I took across that polished marble floor brought me closer to revealing the one secret that would silence them all. When I first married Daniel, I believed I had finally stepped into the kind of life I used to admire from afar. He was kind, attentive, the type of man who pulled out chairs and remembered little details about my day. His family, at least on the surface, embodied old money elegance, perfectly pressed suits, tasteful pearls, and a house that felt more like a museum than a home. I thought I had been accepted into their circle, a daughter-in-law welcomed with open arms. But illusions have a way of cracking, and sometimes they shatter with a single look. The first time my mother-in-law greeted me after the wedding, her lips curved upward in a smile, yet her eyes flickered with disdain. She pressed her cheek lightly against mine, her perfume sharp, almost suffocating, and whispered, "We'll see how long you last." I laughed it off at the time, convincing myself it was just her way, perhaps nerves or even a misunderstanding. But in truth, something inside me tightened, a quiet alarm that I tried to silence. That alarm grew louder the evening of the family's grand celebration, my first official introduction to their wider circle of friends. The mansion buzzed with champagne glasses clinking, violins playing in the corner, and the low hum of expensive conversation. Daniel was whisked away almost immediately by old friends and business partners, leaving me at the side of his mother, Eleanor, a woman who could command an entire room with a single glance. She turned to me, her smile sharpened into something pointed. "Emily, tonight you'll serve drinks." I thought I misheard. Perhaps she meant help pour a toast or hand her a glass of wine, but her voice carried clearly, and nearby guests paused, curious. My cheeks burned as I realized she was serious. "Serve drinks," she repeated, tilting her head toward a tray held by a caterer. "Someone of your background should feel comfortable doing that." A ripple of laughter passed through a few onlookers, soft enough to mask itself as polite chuckling, but sharp enough to pierce. I felt the weight of their eyes, the judgment heavy and deliberate. In that instant, the perfect image of family unity I had built in my head crumbled. This wasn't a welcoming embrace. It was a test, a humiliation staged in front of an audience that thrived on spectacle. I forced a smile, though inside I wanted to vanish. My hands trembled as I reached for the tray. Crystal glasses shimmered under the chandeliers, fragile and dangerous in my grasp. Each step I took across the marble floor echoed too loudly, my heels clicking like a metronome to my shame. Guests glanced at me, some smirking, others whispering behind manicured hands. I felt like a performer in a cruel play, the kind where the script was designed to strip dignity away. Still, I kept moving, one glass after another, serving people who looked through me as if I were invisible. My husband never intervened. He laughed in the distance, oblivious or unwilling to notice. I swallowed the lump in my throat and reminded myself to breathe, to keep my mask in place. Outwardly, I was obedient, the perfect daughter-in-law doing as she was told. But inside, something else began to stir, a slow burn of anger that wrapped itself around my spine. As I refilled another flute of champagne, Eleanor's words replayed in my head. "Someone like you belongs behind the bar." I studied her from across the room, radiant in her gown, surrounded by admirers. She believed she had won, that I would bend beneath her control, grateful even to be given a role at all. The arrogance in her posture was a silent dare, as if she knew I had no choice but to comply. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I wasn't the helpless girl they imagined. Every glass I handed out, every tray I carried only strengthened my resolve. Let them laugh, let them whisper. They thought they were watching me play the part of the servant, but I was studying them, memorizing their cruelty, tucking away each moment like evidence. As the evening stretched on, I caught my reflection in a gilded mirror. My face was calm, almost serene, but my eyes betrayed me. They glinted with something raw, something Eleanor had not anticipated, quiet defiance. For a moment, I wondered if anyone else could see it, if they sensed the storm building beneath my composed exterior. I walked past Eleanor once more, her laughter like glass shattering in my ears. She touched the arm of a guest, whispering something that made them both chuckle. I placed a glass in front of them, and though my smile remained fixed, my thoughts sharpened into a single question. Have I stepped into a golden cage, or have they unknowingly invited a predator into their midst? The chandelier above sparkled brilliantly, its light fractured into 1,000 pieces. I raised my eyes to it and let that fractured glow settle over me like armor. I would endure this charade, but not forever. They thought they were playing the game. The truth was, the real game hadn't even begun. And in that moment, as laughter rose and fell around me like waves, I silently promised myself, they will regret underestimating me. I let the evening unfold as though nothing had touched me. To the eyes watching, I was compliant, moving smoothly through the party with my tray, nodding politely, laughing when laughter was expected. A perfect little ornament of the family, harmless and forgettable. If they thought they had broken me, all the better. A broken woman was no threat. A broken woman was easy to ignore. But beneath my silence, my mind was far from broken. Every insult, every dismissive glance, every whisper, they became bricks, stacking quietly inside me to form something unshakable. I knew better than to react now. This was not the moment for confrontation. It was the moment to sharpen the blade of patience, to let them believe I was weak until they had no reason to guard themselves. Eleanor glanced at me once, her smile curling at the edges. She mistook my calm for surrender, and that mistake was my gift. I lowered my eyes just enough to feed her illusion. Around us, guests saw only a dutiful daughter-in-law who knew her place, a woman willing to bend under pressure. None of them noticed the flicker in my gaze when I caught my reflection in the champagne glass, steel hidden behind glass. Daniel drifted past me, his laughter joining the men around him. He never looked my way, never noticed the tray weighing down my arm. I wondered if he was ashamed of me or simply indifferent. Either way, his silence was a louder betrayal than his words could ever be. Yet I smiled and continued, masking the sting with the precision of someone who had learned long ago that silence could be its own weapon. Midway through the night, when my tray emptied, I slipped toward the side corridor under the pretense of fetching more champagne. Away from the crowd, the music dulled, and I finally allowed myself a single breath of relief. My phone buzzed in the pocket of my dress. I glanced at the screen and a smirk touched my lips before I could stop it. A single message flashed. Deal closed. Transfer confirmed. Property under your name by midnight. It was the culmination of months of quiet work, of endless nights spent studying contracts, of meetings disguised as lunches with friends. The building Eleanor stood so proudly in tonight, the venue she flaunted as her empire, would officially belong to me by the end of the night. I ran my fingers over the phone's glass, the glow reflecting in my eyes like fire. No one in that glittering hall knew the truth. They saw a woman carrying trays, but behind the performance was an owner, a strategist, someone who had mastered the art of timing. My silence wasn't weakness, it was theater, and tonight was opening night. I tucked the phone away and straightened my shoulders before stepping back into the sea of voices. My mask returned instantly, the obedient smile, the lowered eyes. Guests accepted their drinks with casual dismissals, none of them realizing that their laughter was being staged in a hall already shifting ownership beneath their feet. I felt like an actress in a play where only I knew the ending. Eleanor's gaze found me again. She seemed almost triumphant, the predator certain of her prey. She leaned toward one of her friends, whispering just loud enough for me to catch. "She'll never rise above this. Some women are made to serve." The friend laughed, clinking glasses in agreement. I offered them both champagne, my smile calm, my hands steady. Inside, though, I was already rewriting the narrative. They thought this was their stage. Soon they would learn it had always been mine. I moved through the crowd with renewed ease, the weight of the tray lighter now that I carried more than glasses. I carried the truth. My patience, my silence, my carefully crafted weakness were no longer chains. They were weapons, sharpened with every insult they had hurled at me. As the night drew closer to its peak, I lifted my eyes to the towering chandeliers once more. Their crystals refracted the light into shards, scattering across the polished floor, 1,000 fragments of brilliance. In them, I saw reflection after reflection of myself, not the servant they thought I was, but the woman I truly was becoming. And as I placed another glass into the manicured hand of someone who barely acknowledged me, a thought carved itself into the quiet corners of my mind. If you knew what I'm hiding, you wouldn't dare laugh. Not tonight. Not ever again. What they didn't realize was that the game had already shifted. They were celebrating under my roof, and the power they thought belonged to them was already slipping away inch by inch into my grasp. The evening's music swelled, and the hall glimmered under the lights, but all I could hear was the steady rhythm of my own determination. Soon the facade would crack, and when it did, the silence that followed would be mine to command. Every smile I wore that night was a mask, and every word I uttered was a carefully measured note in a long, deliberate performance. I had learned long ago that power rarely came from shouting. It came from patience, from knowing when to stay silent and when to strike. Eleanor, in all her arrogance, thought she was the master manipulator. What she never realized was that I had been studying her every move since the day I entered this family. Her gaslighting had started early, almost the moment Daniel introduced me. The words still echoed in my head, coated in sugar yet sharp enough to wound. "You're not good enough for my son." A week later, when I tried to bring up an idea at a family dinner, she smirked and said, "You should be grateful we even let you into this house." Each time she found new ways to chip at my confidence, reminding me that, in her eyes, I was always less. For months, I swallowed it. I smiled at her barbs, pretended not to notice the way she undermined me in front of Daniel, in front of guests, in front of anyone who would listen. But while she thought I was crumbling, I was recording. Texts, emails, notes from conversations, even a receipt she had accidentally left behind on the kitchen counter. Each piece of evidence slid quietly into the file I was building. Like a pressure cooker, I let it build and build, waiting for the moment when the release would be most devastating. Tonight was shaping into that moment. As the night wore on, Eleanor's control slipped ever so slightly. She had seen something in my eyes earlier, some glint she hadn't expected, and it unsettled her. I caught her watching me longer than usual, whispering to her confidants with quick, sharp words. She sensed I wasn't as pliant as she believed, and so she decided to escalate. I was passing by the grand piano when she called me over, her voice loud enough to draw attention. "Emily, dear," she purred, "why don't you tell everyone about the time you confused a salad fork for a dessert spoon? Such a charming little story." A ripple of laughter broke out. My face remained neutral, but inside I felt the burn of humiliation. She wasn't just mocking me privately anymore. She was staging my downfall before an audience. This was her true stage, public degradation, the stripping away of dignity where witnesses could applaud her cruelty. But she had underestimated me. I excused myself with a polite smile, pretending I needed to check on the caterers. Instead, I slipped into the study, a room heavy with leather-bound books and the faint smell of Eleanor's perfume. I knew what I was looking for. I had found hints before, half-hidden trails of her reckless spending. Tonight, I needed proof. It didn't take long. In the bottom drawer of her desk, tucked beneath a stack of old invitations, was the file. My hands trembled as I opened it. Page after page of failed investments, drained accounts, and most damning of all, documents signed with Daniel's name, authorizing loans Eleanor had taken in his stead. She had bled her own son's finances dry to cover her ambition, all while lecturing me about unworthiness. My pulse thundered as I scanned the pages. Here it was, the weapon I had been waiting for. Not a sword, not a scream, but undeniable truth. The evidence that the woman parading as a queen in this gilded palace was, in reality, balancing on the edge of collapse. I tucked the papers into my clutch, my hands steady now. When I stepped back into the party, the air seemed to hum differently around me. Eleanor's laughter floated across the hall, brittle and sharp, and guests still orbited her like moths to a flame. But I no longer saw a monarch. I saw a woman about to be unmasked. She beckoned me again, this time louder, more insistent, her voice dripping false sweetness. "Emily, dear, why don't you pour a round for our guests? After all, you're so good at serving." More laughter followed, sharper now, cutting across the room. I smiled. I lifted the tray, my posture elegant, my steps calm. And as I walked toward her, I thought to myself, I will not be the one humiliated tonight. The air in the ballroom had grown electric, the kind of tension that sits heavy on the skin, but is invisible to those who believe themselves untouchable. Eleanor stood tall, her gown glittering like armor, the smug curve of her lips daring me to bend once more. Guests lingered in clusters, laughter rising and falling, but I could feel their attention shifting, sensing something they couldn't yet name. I set the tray down gently on the nearest table and stepped forward, my heels clicking against the marble floor. All eyes turned, though they pretended not to. Eleanor smirked, mistaking my movement for compliance. "Yes, Emily, do as you're told," she called, her voice carrying like a whip. I lifted my chin and let my voice cut through the room with measured calm. "If you'd like this party to continue, Eleanor, remember one thing. I am the one who signed the contract for this venue, and I am the one who can end it." The room froze. The violinist's bow faltered, producing a harsh note before silence swallowed the music whole. Guests turned, their gazes darting between us, eyes wide, mouths half open. Eleanor blinked, her practiced composure cracking for the first time that night. For a long moment, no one spoke. The chandeliers sparkled above, throwing fractured light over the stunned faces. Then a single glass clinked softly against a plate, the sound impossibly loud in the stillness. I held her gaze, steady and unflinching. "Did you still want me to serve drinks?" I asked softly. "Or would you prefer I let everyone know this event ends when I say it does?" The silence deepened. Eleanor's lips parted, but no words came. She looked around, searching for support, but the audience was no longer hers. Their attention had shifted entirely to me. Curiosity etched into every face. Inside, my heart pounded, but I let none of it show. The act was complete. The weakness she had fed on was gone. This was not surrender. It was unveiling. A man from the corner of the room, a real estate investor I recognized, cleared his throat. "Emily Carter," he said slowly, "I believe we've spoken before. You were the one behind the Riverside acquisition, weren't you?" Heads turned. Murmurs spread like ripples through water. My secret was no longer a secret. The web I had built quietly in boardrooms and late-night calls was now unfurling in the most public way possible. Eleanor tried to laugh, but it came out brittle. "She's exaggerating. She's just the wife." Another voice cut in, a woman in pearls, a longtime socialite. "No, Eleanor, she's not exaggerating. I attended that closing dinner. Emily was the one leading the discussion." Gasps spread. My phone buzzed again in my clutch, and I already knew what it would say without looking. Confirmation, final signatures, ownership sealed. This hall, this grand mansion they all admired tonight, was mine. I allowed a small smile, just enough to let them see the truth without arrogance. "I've been patient," I said, my tone calm, even gentle. "I've been quiet, but don't mistake silence for weakness." The dominoes began to fall. One by one, guests adjusted their stance, some even stepping closer to me. Conversation shifted in my direction, questions spilling out about investments, about opportunities, about partnerships. The very people who once laughed at me now sought my attention. Eleanor stood rooted, her power dissolving like sugar in water. She opened her mouth again, but this time the words died as another guest stepped forward. "Eleanor," he said with a thin smile, "I came tonight because of Emily. She's the one we trust to get things done." It was a twist she hadn't expected. Her allies weren't hers at all. They were mine. And as the realization dawned, I watched the color drain from her face. I moved past her, my steps measured, my presence now commanding the room. I didn't need to raise my voice. The truth was louder than any declaration I could make. Every deal, every contract, every connection had led to this moment. At the center of the hall, I turned to face them all. "So," I said, my voice steady, "who exactly is hosting this evening? Who truly holds the keys?" The question hung heavy in the air, unanswerable yet undeniable. The guests shifted uneasily, eyes flicking between me and Eleanor, between the past they thought they knew and the future standing in front of them. And in that charged silence, one thought crystallized in my mind, sharper than the chandelier's fractured light. Who is the real master of this house? For the first time since marrying into this family, I felt the balance tip firmly in my favor. Eleanor stood silenced in the middle of her own performance, her allies scattering like frightened birds. The whispers around the hall no longer praised her elegance but questioned her fall. In their eyes, I was no longer the servant, no longer the shadow at the edge of the room. I was the woman who held the pen, the woman who could end the evening with a single call. Yet power, intoxicating as it felt, came at a cost. The silence from Daniel that followed was sharper than Eleanor's words had ever been. He avoided my gaze that night, speaking to me only in clipped phrases, his hand never reaching for mine. At home, the distance widened further. He stayed out later, his phone face down on the counter, his eyes clouded when I tried to draw him close. I wanted to believe it was the shock of the evening, that he needed time to adjust to the truth of who I was. But in quiet moments, doubt gnawed at me. Love was supposed to rejoice in triumph, wasn't it? Why then did his smiles fade each time someone praised me? Why did he flinch when business partners called asking for me instead of him? Eleanor's humiliation had fractured the family, but in the cracks I began to see something far more dangerous than her scorn, Daniel's resentment. One night, as I sat reviewing contracts in my study, I caught him watching me from the doorway. His expression was unreadable, a mask of calm too practiced for my liking. "You've changed," he said finally. I set my pen down. "I've always been this way. You just didn't see it before." He nodded once, slowly, then turned away. The sound of his footsteps down the hall echoed like a warning. In bed, I lay awake, replaying every small detail I had ignored. His eagerness to leave me alone with his mother, his silence when she humiliated me, his lack of surprise when I revealed the truth about the venue. A thought chilled me. Had he known all along? I tried to brush it aside, but the suspicion grew like a thorn pressing deeper with every passing day. I told myself he was conflicted, torn between loyalty to me and to his mother. But as the days slipped into weeks, the evidence mounted. His absence became routine, his excuses repetitive, his warmth evaporated. And then, one evening, the truth revealed itself. Not through words, but through paper. I had returned to Eleanor's study, searching again through her files, curious whether she had left anything else buried in the chaos of her downfall. That was when I found it. a signed document tucked between contracts. Not hers, not in her handwriting, Daniel's. His name sprawled across the page, authorizing one of her reckless loans. My stomach dropped. My hands trembled as I traced the ink. It wasn't just her. He had been part of it, standing behind her, protecting her, enabling her while I believed I was alone in the fight. He hadn't simply turned a blind eye. He had played a role. The betrayal struck deeper than anything Eleanor could have done. She was predictable, her hatred open and sharp. But Daniel? He was the man I had chosen, the man I had trusted to stand beside me, the man I had loved. I closed the file slowly, the paper crackling like a cruel laugh. Every memory replayed in my mind, our vows, his promises, the nights he held me close, all of it soured by the realization that he had never been fully mine. I had slept beside a conspirator, a traitor disguised as a husband. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on me, heavier than any tray I had carried that night at the party. My chest tightened, but my eyes stayed dry. Tears would have been mercy, and mercy was no longer something I could give. As I stood in the dim light of that study, one thought echoed louder than the silence that surrounded me. I have been sleeping next to my enemy all along. The night I uncovered Daniel's betrayal, I felt the floor beneath me give way. The walls of this house, once a symbol of security, closed in, like a cage I had unknowingly stepped into years before. Everything I had endured, Eleanor's venom, the humiliations, the whispers, would have been bearable if Daniel had been at my side, but knowing he had aligned himself with her stripped the last illusion away. I was not a wife. I was a pawn. For days, I walked through the mansion in silence, observing him with new eyes, his casual excuses, his deflections, the way he avoided my gaze. Once, those little details might have been dismissed as stress, fatigue, or distraction. Now I saw them for what they were, the behaviors of a man who had already chosen his side. I spent one last evening sitting across from him at the dinner table, the silence between us louder than the clinking of cutlery. He finally looked up, a shadow of guilt in his eyes. "Emily, you've changed. This isn't who I married." I set my fork down, my voice calm but resolute. "No, Daniel, this is who I've always been. You just never wanted to see it." The decision crystallized then, sharp and unshakable. I would no longer play their game. I would no longer bend to a family built on control, lies, and betrayal. They had mistaken me for a prisoner, but I was already free the moment I realized I didn't need them. The next morning, I placed the divorce papers in front of him. He stared at them, disbelief flickering into anger. "You can't walk away from this," he hissed. I met his glare without flinching. "Watch me. I don't belong to this cage anymore." The words felt like steel on my tongue, the final severing of chains I had carried too long. His face paled, his hands tightening into fists, but I no longer cared. I had spent too many nights trying to make a marriage out of ashes. It was time to leave the fire behind. Walking out of that house, I expected grief to swallow me. Instead, I felt light. The air outside was sharper, freer, as if the world itself had been waiting for me to step into it. For the first time in years, I wasn't defined by their expectations, their cruelty, their betrayals. I was defined by my own choices. Freedom, however, was only the beginning. In the months that followed, I poured myself into work with a ferocity I hadn't allowed before. Deals multiplied, buildings rose, and my name spread through boardrooms and investment circles with a mixture of awe and fear. I was no longer just the quiet woman standing in the shadows. I was the architect of an empire. The venue that had once been Eleanor's stage became the cornerstone of my expansion. From there, I built a chain of properties, each acquisition a stone in the fortress of independence I was constructing. Business partners who once dismissed me now sought me out. Investors placed their faith in me, And for every contract signed, I felt another piece of the old me, silent, diminished, obedient, fall away. People asked if revenge drove me. It didn't. Not anymore. Power wasn't about humiliating those who had wronged me. It was about ensuring I never again needed their approval. My victories weren't for them. They were for me. Still, there were moments, quiet and unguarded, when memory threatened to pull me back. Eleanor's laughter, Daniel's silence, the sting of humiliation in that chandelier-lit hall. But instead of pain, those memories fueled me. Reminders of the cage I had escaped and the woman I refused to become again. One evening, months later, I stood on the balcony of my newest acquisition, a skyscraper piercing the city skyline. The sun dipped low, casting the sky in molten gold. I rested my hands on the railing, breathing in the hum of the city below. This was my realm now, not a mansion dripping with poison, but a world built on my own terms. Behind me, the office still buzzed with energy. Lawyers, architects, and managers working late, each carrying out the vision I had set in motion. My empire was no longer a secret. It was alive, undeniable, impossible to ignore. I thought of Daniel then and Eleanor and the family that had once caged me. They had wanted me small. They had wanted me silent. Instead, they had forged me into something greater than they could have imagined. I turned my gaze to the horizon, where the last light of day stretched into darkness, and I smiled, not with bitterness, but with peace. I had lost a family, but in that loss, I had found something far more powerful. I had found myself.